summer bridge program, I met a young man when I was 15 years old. His name was Zaire Rose. And Zaire was the most fabulous, most flamboyant, flaming queen I had ever met in my 15 years on earth. And when Zaire sauntered into a room, and Zaire did saunter, everything stopped. Zaire told me about this event that happened annually called DC Black Pride. And when I was 16, we went together. And it was the single most affirming experience of my life. I had never been in a room with so many queer people of color who looked like me and identified with me, and it was affirming, and I felt beautiful, and I felt empowered, and it changed my life. Zaire was also an activist in his own right. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, because we're all family, right? And you won't tell my parents and stuff. Don't do this, by the way. Bad idea. Don't do it. Just learn from my experience. My high school wasn't allowed to have a GSA. This is back in about 2003. We had petitioned for one, and we were told we couldn't have one. And I, at the time, had no idea that GLSEN was in existence, and I probably could have gotten some support, like you all have. But Zaire started a GSA at a neighboring high school. So I used to skip 6th period once a week to go to his high school to go to their GSA meetings. I just needed that affirmation on a weekly basis. I needed to see myself in him. Now, as kind and as brave and as courageous as Zaire was, he wasn't very cautious. And at 17, Zaire contracted HIV. Zaire passed away 2.5 years ago. But the impact that he had on my life was resounding and amazing. And so because of Zaire, when I went off to college, I never really actively sought out a GSA, but I happened to be sitting in my dorm room one day, and the announcement for Rainbow Soul came over the loudspeaker in my dormitory. And I remembered my experience with Zaire's GSA, and I somehow knew I had to be there. That was the second most affirming experience in my life. I walked onto the campus of Morgan State University, and I saw a room full of Black queer people. And I got involved. Over my time as the Community Service and Outreach Coordinator for Rainbow Soul, I was able to connect with our state equality organization, Equality Maryland. I was able to connect with the Human Rights Campaign. And of course, I was able to connect with NBJC, where I'm now a Leadership Advisory Council member. My time at Morgan and Rainbow Soul taught me a few things that I'd like to share with you. I kind of have this broken up, so I want to talk to our allies first, because it really taught me how to be an ally. First and foremost, allies, I appreciate the work that you do. I appreciate you breeding our young leaders and the role that you serve in this movement to provide a legacy of leadership. How to be an ally if you are a person with privilege by Dr. Francis E. Kendall has some great tools and tips for ally leadership. And I tried to paraphrase this to just make it as accessible to you as possible. First and foremost, allies educate themselves on the experiences of the oppressed people that they are working for and with. Because allies aren't usually a part of that oppressed group, we have to investigate how our own privilege plays a role in our lives and its impact on our lives. Now, even me as a Black queer woman has privilege. I have cisgender passing, feminine identified American educational middle class privilege, and so I have to be aware and conscious of that. Allies commit to being an ally 24/7. This may mean breaking the assumed allegiances we have with people with our own privilege, which can be very difficult. Within our communities of privilege, allies create other allies. This is really important, and I think that this is probably the most important thing as allies that we can do. We have to shut up, we have to listen, and we have to genuinely learn new ways to support the communities that we advocate for and with from those communities. So there has to be some coalition building. Allies acknowledge our privilege, right? As allies, we have to acknowledge that we have privilege and be intentional in deconstructing it. And as allies, we mess up. But we don't use that as an excuse to not be allies. When we mess up, and of course we do mess up, we apologize, we validate our criticism, and we become intentional in not repeating those same mistakes. We also have to realize that as allies, you are important, but we can't expect a pat on the back for every good work of allyship we do. We understand that by being people of privilege, we often can initiate and facilitate change. Allies don't attempt to be the savior of any oppressed people. So we're not going to ride in like Jake Sully did in Avatar to save the Na'vis. We understand that as allies, that's not our role. And allies are intentionally inclusive, which a lot of times means being the minority at the table or possibly not being at the table altogether. Allies strive to become comfortable with the uncomfortable and uncomfortable with the too comfortable. And what that means is it means stepping outside of our comfort zone, right? It means that we need to be in a space where sometimes what we find is uncomfortable means diversifying and being heterogeneous in the spaces that we surround ourselves with. And lastly, and I think most importantly, allies know that the experiences of oppressed people, even if they don't see them, are routinely invisible, invalidated, and ignored. And so what that means is just because we can't necessarily identify with a particular struggle or a particular lived experience, that a lot of times it's completely erased. And so we have to be sensitive. In a piece I did to Roland Martin, I wrote that if anybody is offended by what you say, if any oppressed group is offended, then that oppressed group is always right. And it doesn't matter if you agree with them or not. They are right by virtue of their lived experience in oppression. Youth. I am in awe of your courage. I am in awe of the work that you do and the movement that you stand in. I understand that there are many youth of color who exist, who are people of color and who are queer and who want to articulate. And so your presence here today is integral and it's important. And I love you and I am just awestruck by your awesomeness. You are amazeballs covered in awesome sauce. But the single most thing that I can have you to remember, if you walk away from nothing else from this conversation, is that before the movement is you. And in order to be in a space where you can be important and integral to the movement, you have to maintain your ability to self-advocate and to be self-aware. I was talking to Shauna before this workshop, and she imparted on me a piece of wisdom, as she often does. She said, you have to infuse your energy into your community. Just marinate on that a little bit. So what does self-advocacy look like? Kent State University's Department of Health, Education, and Human Services defines advocacy as an individual's ability to effectively communicate, convey, negotiate, or assert his or her own interests, desires, needs, and rights. It also involves making decisions and taking responsibility for those actions. Now, in order to self-advocate, you have to become self-aware, right? So you need some self-knowledge. And that means knowing your own needs and your own strengths and your own interests before you can begin to advocate. So let's get into kind of like some of the work, like what does self-advocacy look like? First and foremost, you need to know your own rights and responsibilities. So you have a right to a safe space, and you have a right to be wholly affirmed in who you are and where you are. Learn all that you can about your own disabilities, or your different abilities, rather, your own needs, your own strengths, and your own weaknesses. Know how to effectively communicate and assert what you need. Find out who the necessary people are in order to give you what you need, and contact them. You should always know who can make what you need a reality. And then, be willing to ask questions. I'll never forget in the autobiography of Malcolm X, Malcolm X says, a closed mouth don't get fed. Also understand that we are our own history. We are our own now, and we are our own future. The path that lays before you is not a path that hasn't been charted before. I did a presentation a couple months ago, actually, for a speech class, and I was looking at other genders in Native cultures. And so this European binary of male and female is not how cultures have originally operated. In over 300 American Indian tribes, there were people called Burdakis, who we would kind of associate as trans people, who were able to move fluidly through gender as they felt and were accepted within their tribal community. In Indian communities, there were Haraja people, who again we would kind of qualify as trans, who were able to fluidly move through gender and who were accepted by their community. Dominicans classified these people as Huevedoches, and Saudi Arabians by Omid people. In the 1920s, there's a rich queer person of color culture, the Harlem Renaissance. Has anybody heard of the Harlem Renaissance, high schoolers? Right, so Langston Hughes and Richard Nugent, Countee Cullen, Elaine Locke, Wallace Thurman. There is a rich queer person of color history and a rich queer history throughout the 1920s. The Compton cafeteria riots, a major precursor to Stonewall by trans women of color. Stonewall itself was kicked off by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson, who started throwing rocks at the police. A black and Latina trans woman of color kicked off the biggest riot against the police that spawned our modern queer rights movement. We are our own history. We are our now, and you are our future. I kind of want to leave you with a quote. This quote resonated with me. It's by seminal lesbian poet, author, activist, mother, Audre Lorde. You have to read Audre Lorde in order to be a queer person of color. It's like you get your card revoked if you don't read Audre Lorde. You need to have like one Langston Hughes poem on hand and some Audre Lorde and June Jordan in your repertoire. Otherwise, something happens, and it's just bad. It's bad. Read Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde says, I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only. I cannot believe that freedom from intolerance is the right of one particular group. And I cannot afford to choose between the front on which I must fight my battles of discrimination, wherever they appear to destroy me. And when they appear to destroy me, it will not be long before they appear to destroy you too. Think about that. We do not have the luxury of fighting just one form of our oppression, but our experiences are integral to our intersectionality. And so we understand that in order to battle racism and homophobia and transphobia and sexism and middle-class privilege and capitalism, that we have to take on these things as a system. So as we leave, I would like to charge you with that, with just internalizing those messages. And thank you so much for being here and for listening to me and just being generally wonderful. And I look forward to see the work that you all do in the future.